Have you ever wondered what happens when brilliance is disguised as invisibility, when genius hides behind a mop bucket and years of being overlooked? Sometimes the person quietly cleaning around your desk at 3 a.m. holds the exact solution to the crisis that's about to destroy your company. Tonight, I want to share with you a story about a moment when hidden excellence revealed itself in the most unexpected way, and how one woman's secret past changed not just her own future, but the destiny of everyone around her. In the heart of Seattle's bustling South Lake Union district, where tech giants cast their shadows over coffee shops and startup dreams, there stood a gleaming 40-story tower that housed Pinnacle Dynamics, one of the Pacific Northwest's most ambitious cloud computing companies. The building hummed with the energy of innovation 24 hours a day, its windows glowing like beacons against the Seattle skyline, promising digital transformation to Fortune 500 companies across the globe. But if you walked through those pristine hallways after midnight, when the last ambitious software architect had finally headed home and the security guards were making their rounds, you would encounter a figure so quiet, so unassuming, that most people looked right through her as if she were part of the building's infrastructure itself. Her name was Elena Vasquez, and at 31, she moved through the corporate corridors with the measured precision of someone who had learned that being noticed meant being questioned, and being questioned meant risking everything she had worked so hard to rebuild. Elena arrived at Pinnacle Dynamics every weeknight at 11:30 p.m. sharp, her cleaning cart loaded with supplies, her navy blue uniform pressed and professional, her thick black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that kept it away from her work. She wore no makeup, no jewelry except for a simple silver chain that disappeared beneath her collar, and she had perfected the art of making eye contact just long enough to be polite, but not long enough to invite conversation. To the late-night employees who occasionally crossed her path, Elena was simply part of the building's ecosystem, reliable, thorough, and mercifully quiet. The security guards knew her as the cleaner, who never caused problems, never asked questions, and somehow managed to work around even the most chaotic developer workstations without disturbing a single cable or moving a single post-it note. The few executives who worked late enough to encounter her knew her only as a nod and a murmured "good evening" in accented English that carried hints of a story they never bothered to ask about. What none of them knew, what Elena had buried so deep that sometimes she wondered if she had dreamed it all, was that, less than 4 years ago, she had been staff software engineer Elena Vasquez at Google's Mountain View campus, specializing in distributed systems architecture and large-scale server optimization. Her employee badge had granted her access to some of the most advanced computing infrastructure on the planet. Her name had appeared on patents that formed the backbone of cloud services used by billions of people worldwide. She had presented at conferences, mentored junior engineers, and earned a salary that most people could only dream of. But that was before the panic attacks started, before the nightmares began bleeding into her waking hours, before the hypervigilance that had kept her alive during 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan as a Signal Corps specialist became a liability in the open-plan offices of Silicon Valley. Before the day when the sound of a dropped laptop in the break room sent her diving under a conference table in front of 12 colleagues, her body responding to threats that existed only in the battlefield memories she carried everywhere she went. Elena's journey to Google had been extraordinary enough. A first-generation Mexican-American from East Los Angeles who had earned a full scholarship to UCLA, graduated summa cum laude with a degree in computer science, and then surprised everyone by enlisting in the army right after graduation. She wanted to serve her country, she had told her professors and family, but she also knew that military experience would give her leadership skills and real-world problem-solving abilities that no computer science program could provide. The Army had recognized her potential immediately, fast-tracking her through advanced training and deploying her to manage critical communications infrastructure in some of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan. For 4 years, Elena had thrived. In the military environment, she had led teams of technicians in maintaining satellite communication systems under enemy fire. She had innovated solutions for keeping data networks operational in desert conditions that would fry civilian equipment. She had earned commendations for her ability to diagnose and repair complex technical problems under extreme pressure. Her commanding officers had repeatedly tried to convince her to make the military a career, but Elena had always known that her ultimate goal was to return to civilian technology work. Armed with the discipline and problem-solving skills that military service had given her. When she left the Army with an honorable discharge and a chest full of medals she never talked about, Elena's transition to Google had felt like a natural progression. Her military experience had actually been an asset in the interview process. Tech companies were beginning to recognize the value of veterans who brought unique perspectives and unshakable work ethics to their teams. For 3 years, Elena had excelled at Google, earning rapid promotions and the respect of her peers. She had felt like she was finally building the life she had always envisioned, challenging work that mattered, financial security, and the satisfaction of pushing the boundaries of what technology could accomplish. But post-traumatic stress doesn't operate on civilian timelines or respect professional ambitions. The symptoms that Elena had managed to suppress during her transition period began manifesting in ways that were impossible to hide in a collaborative work environment. The startled reactions to unexpected sounds, the inability to sit with her, back to an open space, the insomnia that left her exhausted and unfocused during important meetings, the way her hands would shake when she had to present to large groups, her body flooding with adrenaline as if she were under attack. Elena had tried everything. Therapy, medication, meditation, exercise routines that would have challenged professional athletes. Some days were better than others, but the unpredictability of her symptoms made it impossible to maintain the consistent high performance that her role demanded. The final straw had come during a critical system outage when Elena's hypervigilant scanning of the server room for potential threats had been misinterpreted as distraction and lack of focus. Her manager, well-meaning but fundamentally unable to understand what Elena was experiencing, had suggested that perhaps she needed to consider whether her adjustment issues were compatible with the high-pressure environment of a major tech company. Elena had resigned the next day before they could make the decision for her. She had told herself it was temporary, that she just needed time to get the help she needed and find better coping strategies. But as weeks turned to months and her savings dwindled, as job interviews became exercises in hiding her struggles, rather than showcasing her abilities, Elena had discovered that the gap in her resume was becoming harder to explain. Potential employers wanted references from Google, but Elena couldn't bring herself to ask former colleagues to vouch for someone who had essentially fled the job they thought she was lucky to have. The transition from unemployed engineer to cleaning services had happened gradually, each step feeling temporary, even as it became more permanent. First, she had taken a part-time job with a commercial cleaning company to pay rent while she figured out her next move. Then, when the cleaning work proved to be one of the few environments where her hypervigilance was actually useful, where being constantly aware of her surroundings and potential problems was an asset rather than a liability. She had found herself working more hours and applying for fewer tech jobs. The night shift at Pinnacle Dynamics had been presented to her as a premium assignment. The pay was better than most cleaning jobs. The environment was clean and climate-controlled, and the work was predictable and solitary. Elena could wear headphones, work at her own pace, and avoid the complex social dynamics that had become so exhausting for her. Most importantly, she could be invisible. No one expected conversation, innovation, or leadership from the night cleaning staff. They just expected the work to be done quietly and thoroughly, and Elena had discovered she could do that work, while her mind processed the technical challenges she observed around her. Because despite everything that had happened, despite the career she had walked away from and the identity she had shed, Elena's brain still worked like an engineer's. As she emptied trash cans filled with failed code printouts, she couldn't help but notice the logic errors that had led to the failures. When she dusted monitors displaying system architecture diagrams, she automatically looked for bottlenecks and inefficiencies. When she cleaned whiteboards covered with debugging strategies, she saw solutions that the teams had overlooked. But seeing solutions and acting on them were entirely different things. Elena had learned to keep her observations to herself, to clean around the evidence of technical struggles without offering the help she knew she could provide. She had built a life around invisibility, and invisibility meant safety. It meant steady income, predictable routines, and freedom from the judgment and expectations that had become so overwhelming in her previous career. Elena's workstation at Pinnacle Dynamics was a supply closet on the 32nd floor that had been converted into a break area for cleaning staff. It contained a small table, a coffee maker that had seen better days, and a bulletin board covered with work schedules and safety reminders in English and Spanish. This was where Elena would take her lunch break at 3 a.m., eating sandwiches she had packed at home while reviewing the route plan for the rest of her shift. It was also where she kept a small notebook hidden beneath cleaning supply inventories, where she sometimes sketched out solutions to the technical problems she encountered during her work. Elena told herself the notebook was just a mental exercise, a way to keep her engineering skills sharp in case she ever decided to return to the field. But the truth was that it had become something more therapeutic than practical. Working through complex technical problems in her mind and on paper was one of the few activities that quieted the constant vigilance her brain maintained. When she was analyzing system architectures or optimizing algorithms, her mind was focused on puzzles instead of threats, on creation instead of survival. The notebook contained dozens of solutions to problems she had observed throughout Pinnacle Dynamics, database optimization strategies that could improve query response times by orders of magnitude, network configurations that would reduce latency and improve reliability, security improvements that would close vulnerabilities she had noticed in system documentation left carelessly on desks. Elena had even sketched out a complete redesign of the company's backup infrastructure that would reduce costs while improving data protection. But these solutions remained locked in her notebook, just as her expertise remained locked behind her uniform and her carefully maintained invisibility. Every morning, as Elena clocked out and walked to the parking garage where her 10-year-old Honda Civic waited to take her home to her studio apartment in Beacon Hill, she would pass the portraits of Pinnacle Dynamics' leadership team displayed in the main lobby. At the center of the display was a large photograph of Dr. James Morrison, the company's founder and CEO, a former Microsoft executive who had built Pinnacle Dynamics into a billion-dollar enterprise by promising enterprise clients that his company could solve their most complex data management challenges. To Elena, Dr. Morrison was just another face on the wall, someone who existed in a world so far removed from hers that they might as well have lived on different planets. She knew from overheard conversations and company newsletters that he was brilliant, demanding, and absolutely committed to maintaining Pinnacle Dynamics' reputation for technical excellence. She knew that he personally reviewed major system architectures, and that his approval was required for any changes to the company's core infrastructure. But she also knew that someone like James Morrison would never see someone like Elena Vasquez as anything more than part of the building's maintenance crew. What Elena didn't know was that her careful invisibility was about to be shattered by a crisis that would force her to choose between the safety of hiding and the risk of revealing just how much expertise was concealed behind her cleaning cart and her quiet demeanor. She didn't know that Dr. Morrison's company was about to face a technical catastrophe that would threaten not just their business operations, but the livelihoods of every person who worked in that gleaming tower. And she certainly didn't know that her hidden skills were about to become the key to saving everything she had grown to care about, even from a distance. The stage was set for a collision between Elena's buried past and her present reality, between the engineer she had been and the invisible worker she had become. In less than 72 hours, a server crisis would force Elena Vasquez to make the choice that would determine not just her own future, but the future of everyone around her. The crisis that would change everything began on a Wednesday evening. At exactly 6:47 p.m., though it would be hours before anyone at Pinnacle Dynamics fully understood the magnitude of what they were facing. Dr. James Morrison was in his corner office on the 42nd floor, reviewing quarterly performance reports, when his desktop computer screen flickered once, twice, and then went completely black. At first, he assumed it was a simple power glitch or perhaps an issue with his individual workstation, the kind of minor technical hiccup that happened occasionally in any large office building. But within minutes, Morrison's assistant was knocking on his door with an expression of barely controlled panic. "Dr. Morrison," she said, her voice tight with anxiety, "we're getting reports of system failures throughout the building. The primary servers are down, backup systems aren't responding, and our entire cloud infrastructure appears to be offline." Morrison felt his stomach drop as the implications hit him like a physical blow. Pinnacle Dynamics wasn't just another tech company. They were the backbone of critical operations for over 300 enterprise clients across North America. Hospitals relied on their systems for patient data management. Financial institutions used their infrastructure for real-time transaction processing. Manufacturing companies depended on their cloud services for supply chain coordination. When Pinnacle Dynamics went down, it didn't just affect their own employees. It sent ripples through entire industries. Within 30 minutes, Morrison's executive conference room had been transformed into a war room. Chief Technology Officer Dr. Sarah Kim was coordinating with the infrastructure team via conference call, while simultaneously reviewing system logs on 3 different laptops. Head of Operations Marcus Chen was fielding increasingly frantic calls from major clients whose own operations were grinding to a halt. The company's lead systems architect, David Park, was physically in the server room 3 floors below, his voice crackling over the intercom as he described a cascade of hardware failures that seemed to be spreading through their primary data. "Center like a digital virus. It's not just one server," Park reported, his usual calm professionalism cracking under pressure. "We're seeing systematic failures across multiple rack systems. Primary storage arrays are corrupted, backup drives are showing I/O errors, and even our redundant systems are failing to initialize. I've never seen anything like this." Dr. Kim pulled up the system monitoring dashboard on the main conference room display, and the sea of red error indicators painted a picture that made everyone in the room fall silent. Critical systems that were supposed to have multiple layers of redundancy were showing complete failures. Database servers that had run flawlessly for years were refusing to start. Network switches that formed the backbone of their entire infrastructure were dropping offline in sequences that suggested either catastrophic hardware failure or something even worse, a coordinated cyber attack. "How is this possible?" Morrison asked his voice barely above a whisper. We spent $40 million on redundant systems specifically to prevent this kind of scenario. We have backup systems for our backup systems. How are we looking at complete infrastructure failure? The answer came from Jennifer Walsh, the company's chief information security officer, who had been analyzing logs at a workstation in the corner. "James," she said, turning to face the room with an expression that combined exhaustion and dread, "I think we're dealing with a perfect storm scenario. The initial failure appears to have been a hardware cascade in Rack 7, probably a power supply failure that took out multiple drives simultaneously. But here's the problem. Our automatic failover systems tried to compensate by redistributing the load to backup arrays, and that process appears to have triggered a firmware bug in our storage controllers." She pulled up a technical diagram that looked like abstract art to most people in the room, but told a devastating story to those who understood enterprise infrastructure. The firmware bug caused corrupted write operations across multiple storage systems. Every time our backup systems tried to restore data from redundant sources, they were actually spreading the corruption further through the network. Instead of fixing the problem, our redundancy systems made it exponentially worse. Morrison stared at the diagram, trying to process the implications. How long to restore from external backups? That's where it gets complicated, Dr. Kim replied, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard as she pulled up backup system status reports. Our external backup facility in Portland is showing synchronization errors dating back 3 weeks. It looks like there was a gradual degradation in our backup verification systems that went undetected until now. We have backups, but we can't guarantee their integrity or completeness. The room fell silent, except for the hum of laptops and the distant sound of emergency generators kicking in as building systems tried to compensate for the massive power draw of servers that were failing to boot properly. Morrison looked around, the table at the faces of his senior leadership team, brilliant people who had built their careers on solving impossible technical problems, and saw an expression he had never seen before: complete bewilderment. "Timeline," Morrison said. "Simply, best case scenario, how long until we're operational again?" David Park's voice crackled over the intercom from the server room. "If we can restore from clean backups and rebuild the affected systems from scratch, we're looking at minimum 72 hours. That assumes we can isolate the firmware issues and prevent them from corrupting the restored data. But honestly, James, I'm not confident we fully understand what we're dealing with. This could take a week or more." "A week." Morrison closed his eyes and tried to calculate the damage. Pinnacle Dynamics had service-level agreements that guaranteed 99.9% uptime with substantial financial penalties for extended outages. A week-long failure wouldn't just cost them millions in penalty payments. It would destroy their reputation in an industry where reliability was everything. Their competitors would be circling like sharks, offering emergency services to displaced Pinnacle clients who might never return once their trust was broken. But the financial implications were only part of the disaster. Morrison thought about Seattle Children's Hospital, which relied on Pinnacle's systems for patient record management and treatment coordination. He thought about Northwest Financial, whose real-time transaction processing couldn't function without their cloud infrastructure. He thought about the dozens of manufacturing clients whose supply chains would be disrupted, the logistics companies whose tracking systems would go dark, the research institutions whose data analysis workflows would grind to a halt. "All right," Morrison said, forcing his voice to project a confidence he didn't feel. "We're going to solve this. Sarah, I want every contractor and consultant we've ever worked with on conference calls within the hour. Marcus, start drafting client communications. We need to be transparent about the situation while projecting competence and control. Jennifer, expand your security analysis. If this is an attack rather than a hardware failure, we need to..." No, immediately. As his team scattered to execute crisis management protocols, Morrison remained in the conference room, staring at the wall of red error indicators that represented the potential collapse of everything he had spent 15 years building. Pinnacle Dynamics had started in his garage with a simple vision: enterprise-grade cloud infrastructure that was so reliable, so well-designed, that businesses could trust it with their most critical operations. Now that vision was crumbling, in real time, undermined by the very redundancy systems that were supposed to make catastrophic failure impossible. The next 12 hours became a blur of emergency conference calls with hardware vendors, desperate attempts to restore systems from increasingly suspect backup sources, and frantic communications with clients who were beginning to demand explanations for outages that were affecting their own customers and operations. Morrison had authorized emergency expenditures that would normally require board approval, flying in specialist contractors from across the country, purchasing replacement hardware at premium emergency rates, even exploring the possibility of temporarily migrating client operations to competitor systems if it meant preserving the relationships that formed the foundation of their business. But by Thursday evening, as Morrison stood in the server room, surveying rows of equipment that stubbornly refused to function despite the efforts of some of the most skilled technicians in the Pacific Northwest, he was forced to confront a possibility that terrified him more than financial loss or professional humiliation. They might not be able to fix this at all. "The corruption is deeper than we initially thought," Dr. Kim reported during the 8 p.m. status meeting, her voice hoarse from 18 hours of continuous crisis management. "Every time we think we've isolated clean data, we discover additional layers of file system damage. The firmware bug didn't just corrupt individual files, it appears to have damaged the underlying storage allocation tables that tell our systems where data is actually located on the physical drives." David Park, who hadn't left the server room in over 24 hours and was now surviving on energy drinks and determination, provided the technical details that painted an even grimmer picture. "We're basically looking at a scenario where we have terabytes of client data that still exists physically on our storage devices, but our systems have lost the ability to find and access it reliably. It's like having a massive library where someone has scrambled all the catalog cards, the books are still there, but we can't locate them systematically." Morrison felt something cold settle in his chest as the full implications became clear. "Are you telling me that we might have to inform our clients that their data is effectively lost?" "Not lost," Park clarified quickly, "but potentially inaccessible, using conventional recovery methods. We could theoretically rebuild the storage allocation tables manually, but that would require analyzing every sector of every drive to identify data patterns and reconstruct the organizational structure. With the amount of data we're dealing with, that process could take months or even years." The conference room fell silent as everyone absorbed the magnitude of what Park had just described. Months or years to recover client data that businesses needed to access within hours to maintain their own operations. Service-level agreements that promised rapid disaster recovery were now meaningless in the face of a technical challenge that exceeded anything their teams had encountered before. Morrison looked around the room at his exhausted leadership team, brilliant professionals who had reached the limits of their considerable expertise. He thought about the phone calls he would have to make to major clients, the press conferences where he would have to explain how a company built on the promise of reliability had suffered a catastrophic failure that might be irreversible. He thought about the employees whose jobs depended on Pinnacle Dynamics maintaining its reputation and client base, about the competitors who would benefit from their misfortune, about the career he had spent decades building that might not survive. The next few days But Morrison also thought about something else, about the military principle that had guided him through previous crises in his career, both in the Marines and in the corporate world. When conventional solutions failed, when expertise reached its limits, when systems broke down beyond the ability of normal processes to repair them, sometimes the answer came from unexpected sources. Sometimes the person with the solution wasn't the person with the highest title or the most credentials, but the person with a different perspective, a unique background, or an unconventional approach to problem solving. As Morrison prepared to authorize what might be the final round of emergency recovery attempts before they would have to consider the unthinkable, publicly acknowledging that Pinnacle Dynamics could not recover from this failure, he made a decision that would surprise his team and potentially change everything. Instead of limiting their crisis response to senior technical staff and expensive contractors, he was going to expand their efforts to include anyone in the building who might have relevant expertise, regardless of their official role or position in the company hierarchy. "I want to talk to everyone," Morrison announced to his surprised leadership team. "Every contractor, every consultant, every employee who has any technical background whatsoever. I don't care if they're software developers or network administrators or help desk technicians. If someone in this building has ever worked with enterprise storage systems, database recovery, or large-scale infrastructure management, I want them in this room tomorrow morning." Dr. Kim looked puzzled. "James, we've already consulted with the best experts available. What makes you think someone else might have insights that our senior team has missed?" Morrison stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Seattle skyline, where the lights of other companies continued to shine brightly while Pinnacle Dynamics faced its darkest hour. "Because sometimes the solution doesn't come from the people you expect," he said quietly. "Sometimes it comes from someone who sees the problem differently, who approaches it from an angle that conventional wisdom has overlooked." What Morrison didn't know was that 30 floors below, Elena Vasquez was beginning her night shift, pushing her cleaning cart through corridors filled with the aftermath of crisis management. Empty coffee cups, abandoned laptops, whiteboards covered with increasingly desperate technical diagrams. He didn't know that as she emptied trash cans filled with failed recovery attempt documentation, Elena was automatically analyzing the approaches that had been tried and mentally cataloging the strategies that had been overlooked. He certainly didn't know that in her supply closet break room, Elena had spent her lunch break sketching out a potential solution in her hidden notebook, a solution based on distributed systems recovery techniques she had developed during her Google years and refined through military experience with maintaining communications infrastructure under adverse conditions. A solution that addressed the specific type of cascade failure that was currently destroying his company, using methods that wouldn't occur to engineers who had never worked with systems that were designed to function reliably, even when fundamental components failed catastrophically. The stage was set for the collision between Morrison's expanding search for solutions and Elena's carefully hidden expertise. In less than 12 hours, the CEO, who was willing to consider unconventional approaches, would encounter the cleaning woman who possessed exactly the unconventional expertise his company desperately needed. Elena arrived for her Thursday night shift to find Pinnacle Dynamics transformed into something she had never seen before. The usually pristine corporate environment had been replaced by what looked like a disaster zone. Conference rooms packed with exhausted technicians surrounded by laptops and empty energy drink cans, hallways cluttered with emergency equipment that had been wheeled in from various parts of the building, and whiteboards covered with increasingly frantic technical diagrams that told the story of a company fighting for its survival. The normal rhythms of corporate life had been completely disrupted. Instead of the usual handful of late-working employees, the building buzzed with activity at all hours. Elena could hear urgent conversations echoing from conference rooms, the constant ping of emergency notifications, and the low hum of equipment that was running far beyond its normal capacity. Even the building's environmental system seemed stressed, with air conditioning units working overtime to cool server rooms that were generating excess heat from desperate recovery attempts. As Elena checked in with the security desk, she noticed that the usually cheerful night security guard, Tommy Rodriguez, looked exhausted and overwhelmed. "Crazy night," he said, shaking his head as he handed her the access card that would allow her to clean the upper floors. "Whole company's gone. Crazy. Something about the computers being broken and nobody knowing how to fix them." Elena nodded politely and headed toward the service elevator, but Tommy's words echoed in her mind as she rode up to begin her shift on the 32nd floor. She had overheard fragments of conversation during previous nights, mentions of system updates, client meetings, technical challenges that were part of the normal rhythm of a technology company. But this felt different. The energy in the building carried an undercurrent of genuine panic that Elena recognized from her military experience, the particular tension that emerged when capable people confronted problems that exceeded their ability to solve quickly. The 32nd floor had been transformed into an extended technical operations center. Conference rooms that normally hosted client presentations were now filled with emergency equipment, servers that had been pulled from racks for diagnostic testing, networking equipment that was being reconfigured in real time, and workstations, displaying system monitoring tools that painted increasingly grim pictures with each passing hour. Elena could see exhausted engineers hunched over laptops, their faces illuminated by screens showing endless streams of error messages and diagnostic data. As she began her cleaning routine, Elena found herself automatically cataloging the technical evidence scattered throughout the work areas, printouts of system logs that showed cascade failures across multiple storage arrays, whiteboard diagrams illustrating network topologies that had been systematically compromised by firmware issues, technical documentation for recovery procedures that had been attempted and abandoned when they failed to produce results. Elena's engineering mind couldn't help but process the information she was observing, even as she maintained her careful facade of invisibility. She could see from the diagnostic reports that Pinnacle Dynamics was dealing with a distributed storage failure that had been exacerbated by redundancy systems that had actually amplified the initial problem rather than containing it. The technical approaches being attempted were methodical and well-reasoned, but they were also fundamentally conservative, focused on restoring systems to their previous state rather than adapting to the new reality created by the cascade. Failure. In conference room C, which Elena cleaned around 1:30 a.m., she found a whiteboard covered with recovery timeline estimates that ranged from optimistic projections of 3 days to pessimistic scenarios extending beyond 2 weeks. The math was straightforward enough. Manually rebuilding corrupted storage allocation tables for terabytes of enterprise data using conventional techniques would require an enormous amount of time and computational resources. But Elena could see approaches that weren't represented on the whiteboard, techniques she had used during her military service when communications infrastructure had been damaged by hostile action and conventional repair methods weren't fast enough to maintain operational capability. The distributed recovery techniques Elena had pioneered during her Afghanistan deployments were specifically designed for scenarios where system failures were too extensive. For traditional restore from backup approaches, when satellite communication arrays were damaged by electronic warfare or physical attack, waiting days or weeks for complete system rebuilds wasn't an option. Military communications had to be restored quickly, using whatever functional components remained, even if that meant operating with reduced capability or unconventional configurations. Elena had developed methods for creating partial functional systems from corrupted infrastructure, using advanced algorithms to identify and isolate clean data segments that could be rapidly integrated into temporary operational frameworks. The techniques required deep understanding of low-level storage systems and the ability to work with damaged data structures, but they could restore critical functionality in hours rather than days or weeks. As Elena continued her cleaning rounds, she found herself mentally mapping the technical approaches that Pinnacle Dynamics' team was pursuing and comparing them to the military-derived techniques that might be more appropriate for their current crisis. The conventional enterprise recovery methods being attempted were designed for scenarios where clean backups were available and systems could be rebuilt from known good states. But in situations where backup integrity was compromised and multiple redundancy systems had failed simultaneously, different approaches were needed. The server room on the 35th floor provided Elena with the most comprehensive view of the technical challenge facing the company. As she cleaned around the diagnostic equipment that had been set up to monitor recovery attempts, she could see real-time displays showing the extent of the storage system corruption. The visualization tools painted a clear picture of how the initial hardware failure had cascaded through interconnected systems, creating a web of dependencies that made conventional recovery approaches ineffective. Elena recognized the pattern from her military experience. It was similar to the cascade failures she had encountered when communication networks were subjected to sophisticated electronic warfare attacks designed to exploit redundancy systems and turn them into vectors for spreading damage throughout the infrastructure. The solution wasn't to restore everything to its previous state, but to create new operational frameworks that could function effectively despite the compromised components. But recognizing potential solutions and having the opportunity to implement them were entirely different challenges. Elena was acutely aware that her insights, no matter how valuable they might be, were trapped behind the invisible barriers that separated her current role from the technical crisis management happening around her. She was the night cleaning staff, not a systems engineer. Her observations were incidental to her actual job responsibilities, and suggesting technical solutions would require revealing expertise that she had spent years carefully concealing. The psychological barriers were as significant as the practical ones. Elena had constructed her invisible identity specifically to avoid the performance pressures and social complexity that had become so overwhelming during her previous career. Stepping forward with technical solutions would mean abandoning the safety of anonymity and subjecting herself to exactly the kind of scrutiny and evaluation that had triggered her most severe anxiety responses at Google. Elena thought about Dr. Morrison, whose framed photograph she passed each morning when leaving the building. She had never met him personally, but she had observed enough of the corporate culture at Pinnacle Dynamics to understand that he was the kind of executive who valued results above all else. If she could somehow communicate her insights to someone in a position to evaluate them, there was a reasonable chance that the technical merit of her suggestions would be considered regardless of their source. But the path from insight to implementation seemed impossibly complicated. Elena couldn't simply walk into a crisis management meeting and announce that the night cleaning woman had solutions that the senior technical staff had overlooked. Even if her suggestions were technically sound, the social dynamics of the situation would likely prevent them from being taken seriously. Corporate hierarchies didn't easily accommodate the possibility that critical expertise might be hidden behind a janitorial uniform. As Elena finished her rounds and returned to her supply closet break room, she found herself facing a decision that felt increasingly urgent. The technical evidence she had observed throughout the building suggested that Pinnacle Dynamics was running out of time. The conventional recovery approaches being attempted were methodical and professional, but they were also insufficient for the scale and complexity of the current crisis. Without a fundamental change in strategy, the company was heading toward a catastrophic failure that would affect not just their own operations, but the hundreds of client organizations that depended on their infrastructure. Elena pulled out her hidden notebook and began sketching a comprehensive technical solution based on the distributed recovery techniques she had developed during her military service. The approach would require significant modifications to work with Pinnacle Dynamics' specific infrastructure, but the core principles were directly applicable. Instead of trying to restore corrupted storage systems to their previous state, the technique would create new operational frameworks that could provide essential functionality while damaged components were gradually rebuilt in the background. The solution would involve identifying and isolating functional data segments from corrupted storage arrays, using advanced algorithmic techniques to verify data integrity without relying on compromised allocation tables, and implementing temporary distributed storage configurations that could maintain client operations while permanent repairs were completed. The approach was technically sophisticated and would require careful coordination between multiple teams, but it could potentially restore critical functionality within hours rather than days or weeks. As Elena worked through the technical details, documenting recovery procedures and system architecture modifications that would be necessary for implementation, she felt the familiar satisfaction of solving complex engineering problems. Her mind operated with the clarity and precision that had made her successful at Google, analyzing system dependencies and optimization opportunities with the same intensity that had once earned her patent credits and conference presentations. But the satisfaction was tempered by the growing realization that having the solution and being able to implement it were fundamentally different challenges. Elena's notebook contained detailed technical specifications that could potentially save Pinnacle Dynamics from catastrophic failure, but those specifications were meaningless as long as they remained hidden in a supply closet known only to a cleaning woman who had carefully constructed her invisibility to avoid exactly the kind of visibility that would be required to share them. Elena closed her notebook and prepared to finish her shift, knowing that in a few hours she would clock out and drive home to her studio apartment, carrying with her the knowledge that she possessed solutions to problems that were currently defeating some of the most skilled engineers in the Pacific Northwest. The weight of that knowledge felt heavier with each passing hour as she struggled with the growing tension between her need for safety and her recognition that her expertise might be the key to preventing a disaster that would affect thousands of people. The crisis at Pinnacle Dynamics was entering its most critical phase, with conventional recovery methods proving inadequate and time running out for alternative approaches. Elena's hidden expertise represented a potential solution, but accessing that expertise would require her to abandon the invisibility that had become her primary coping mechanism and step forward into exactly the kind of high-pressure, high-visibility situation that had driven her away from her previous career. The stage was set for the moment when Elena would have to choose between the safety of remaining hidden and the risk of revealing that the solutions everyone was desperately seeking might be found in the most unexpected place of all. By Friday afternoon, the crisis at Pinnacle Dynamics had evolved from a technical emergency into an existential threat that was rippling through industries across the Pacific Northwest and beyond. What had begun as a cascade failure in server infrastructure had become a cascading business disaster that was growing more severe with each passing hour. Dr. Morrison stood in his office, fielding the seventh emergency call of the day from Major. clients whose own operations were grinding to a halt due to Pinnacle's continued outage. The call that broke something inside Morrison came from Dr. Patricia Williams, Chief Information Officer at Seattle Children's Hospital. Her voice carried a controlled desperation that Morrison had never heard from the usually unflappable executive who had been one of Pinnacle's most trusted partners for over 5 years. "James," Dr. Williams said, her words measured but urgent, "I need you to understand what we're facing here. Our patient management systems have been offline for 48 hours. We're operating on paper backup procedures that we haven't used in a decade. Our surgical scheduling system is down, our pharmacy inventory management is offline, and our laboratory results database is completely inaccessible." Morrison felt his chest tighten as the implications hit him. "Patricia, I know this is unacceptable. We have our entire team working around the clock." "James," she interrupted, her professional composure cracking slightly, "we have pediatric patients whose treatment protocols are stored in your systems. We have medication dosage calculations that depend on data we can't access. We have surgical procedures scheduled based on information that we can't retrieve. This isn't just about business operations anymore. This is about children's lives." The call ended with Dr. Williams informing Morrison that Seattle Children's Hospital was beginning emergency procedures to migrate their critical systems to a competitor's infrastructure. It was a decision that would cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars in emergency migration fees and would likely result in a permanent loss of business for Pinnacle Dynamics, but it was a decision that prioritized patient safety over vendor loyalty. Morrison set down his phone and looked out at the Seattle skyline, knowing that similar conversations were happening in boardrooms across the region. Northwest Financial had already begun transitioning their transaction processing to backup providers after their ATM network had been offline for 36 hours. Pacific Manufacturing was facing production line shutdowns because their supply chain coordination systems couldn't access critical inventory data. 3 major logistics companies had threatened legal action over service-level agreement violations that were costing them millions of dollars in delayed shipments and disrupted operations. The financial implications were staggering, but Morrison was beginning to understand that the financial damage might be the least of their problems. Pinnacle Dynamics had built their reputation on being the infrastructure provider that other businesses could trust with their most critical operations. They had marketed themselves as the company that understood the difference between acceptable risk and catastrophic failure, the partner that could be counted on when reliability mattered more than cost savings. That reputation was evaporating in real time, destroyed not just by the technical failure itself, but by their apparent inability to resolve it using conventional methods. Word was spreading through the industry that Pinnacle Dynamics, the company that had promised enterprise-grade reliability, was facing a technical crisis that exceeded their ability to manage. Competitors were already reaching out to displaced Pinnacle clients, offering emergency migration services and long-term contracts that would be difficult to reverse once the immediate crisis was resolved. Dr. Sarah Kim knocked on Morrison's office door with an expression that had become increasingly familiar over the past 3 days. Exhaustion mixed with frustration and growing desperation. "James," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk, "I need to give you an update on our recovery efforts, and I'm afraid it's not good news." Morrison gestured for her to continue, though he suspected he already knew what she was going to tell him. "We've exhausted every conventional recovery approach in our playbook," Dr. Kim continued, her voice hoarse from stress and lack of sleep. "The manual storage allocation table reconstruction is proceeding, but our latest projections show it will take a minimum of 6 weeks to complete, and that's assuming we don't encounter additional complications." She pulled up a technical report on her tablet and turned it toward Morrison. The firmware corruption is more extensive than we initially realized. Every time we think we've isolated a clean data segment, we discover additional layers of file system damage that require completely rebuilding the underlying storage structures. We're not just dealing with corrupted files, we're dealing with compromised storage architectures that need to be redesigned from the ground up. Morrison studied the technical diagrams, though most of the details were beyond his expertise as a business executive. What he could understand were the timeline projections and resource requirements, both of which painted a picture of recovery efforts that would extend far beyond what any client would accept and would cost far more than the company could sustain. What about the contractors we brought in from IBM and Oracle? Morrison asked. Surely enterprise-level expertise can find approaches that our internal team hasn't considered. Dr. Kim shook her head slowly. They're encountering the same fundamental challenges. The scale and complexity of the corruption exceeds what conventional enterprise recovery tools are designed to handle. They keep coming back to the same conclusion: that manual reconstruction is the only reliable approach, and manual reconstruction takes time that we don't have. Morrison felt something cold settling in his stomach as the full implications became clear. Sarah, are you telling me that we're looking at a scenario where Pinnacle Dynamics might not be able to recover from this failure? I'm telling you that we're rapidly approaching the point where the damage to our business relationships will be irreversible, regardless of when we manage to restore technical functionality, Dr. Kim replied. Every hour that our systems remain offline, we lose more clients to competitors who are offering emergency services and permanent alternatives. Even if we could restore full functionality tomorrow, the trust damage might be too extensive to repair. As if to underscore her point, Morrison's assistant knocked on the door to inform him that 3 more major clients had called to initiate contract termination procedures. The cascade failure was becoming a business cascade failure, with technical problems creating client defections that were undermining the company's financial stability and market position in ways that might prove impossible to reverse. Morrison walked to his office window and looked down at the building's parking garage, where he could see the cars of employees who had been working around the clock for the past 3 days. Dedicated professionals who had built their careers at Pinnacle Dynamics, who had families and mortgages and college funds that depended on the company's continued success. If they couldn't resolve this crisis quickly, those employees would be looking for new jobs, and Morrison would be responsible for the collapse of a company that had once represented the pinnacle of technical reliability and innovation. But Morrison was also thinking about something else, about the military leadership principles that had guided him through previous crises, both during his Marine Corps service and in the early days of building Pinnacle Dynamics from a startup into a major enterprise. When conventional approaches failed, when standard operating procedures proved inadequate, when expertise reached its limits, effective leaders had to be willing to consider unconventional solutions and non-traditional sources of insight. During his deployment in Iraq, Morrison had learned that the most effective solutions to complex problems sometimes came from unexpected sources. Junior enlisted personnel who had different perspectives on tactical challenges, local contractors who understood environmental factors that weren't covered in official manuals, or specialists from other units who brought expertise that hadn't been anticipated when the mission was initially planned. The principle that had served him well in military leadership was simple. When facing an unprecedented crisis, expand your search for solutions beyond the obvious sources and be willing to consider insights from anyone who might have relevant expertise, regardless of their position in the formal hierarchy. Morrison turned back to Dr. Kim with a decision that surprised both of them. Sarah, I want you to cancel all existing recovery efforts and implement a new approach. Instead of limiting our crisis response to senior technical staff and external contractors, I want to talk to everyone in this building who has any relevant technical background. Dr. Kim looked puzzled. James, we've already consulted with every systems engineer, database administrator, and infrastructure specialist on our payroll. We've brought in contractors with decades of enterprise recovery experience. What makes you think someone else might have insights that we've missed? Morrison began pacing behind his desk, his mind working through possibilities that conventional management thinking would have dismissed immediately. Because sometimes the person with the solution isn't the person with the highest credentials or the most obvious qualifications. Sometimes it's someone who approaches the problem from a completely different angle, someone who has experience with challenges that don't fit the standard enterprise recovery model. He stopped pacing and faced Dr. Kim directly. I want you to schedule interviews with every employee in this building who has any background in systems administration, software development, network engineering, or infrastructure management. I don't care if they're help desk technicians, junior developers, or contractors working on unrelated projects. If someone has worked with large-scale technical systems, I want to talk to them. Dr. Kim looked skeptical. James, most of those people don't have experience with enterprise-level infrastructure failures. What could a help desk technician possibly contribute to storage allocation table reconstruction? Morrison sat down and looked directly at his chief technology officer, drawing on leadership lessons that had been forged in combat zones, where unconventional thinking often meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Sarah, conventional thinking got us into this situation, and conventional thinking hasn't gotten us out. We've spent 3 days applying textbook solutions to a problem that doesn't fit the textbook parameters. He pulled up the crisis timeline on his computer and turned the screen toward her. Every recovery approach we've attempted has been based on assumptions about how enterprise systems should be restored after major failures. But what if those assumptions are wrong for this particular scenario? What if someone with a different background, military experience, startup environments, or non-traditional technical training has encountered similar challenges and developed solutions that don't appear in enterprise recovery manuals? Dr. Kim was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what Morrison was suggesting. You're talking about potentially involving dozens of people in crisis management activities that they're not qualified to handle. The security implications alone. And I'm talking about casting a wider net for solutions before we accept that this company is going to fail, Morrison interrupted. Sarah, we're facing a crisis that has defeated our best people using our best methods. At this point, what do we have to lose by considering approaches that we haven't tried yet? Morrison stood up and walked to the whiteboard in his office, where he began sketching out an expanded crisis response structure that would involve technical personnel from throughout the organization. Here's what we're going to do. Tomorrow morning, we're going to hold an all-hands technical meeting. Every employee with any systems background gets invited. We're going to present the technical challenges we're facing and ask for input from anyone who thinks they might have relevant insights. He turned back to Dr. Kim, who was looking at him with an expression that combined concern and curiosity. We're going to operate on the assumption that somewhere in this building there might be someone with experience or expertise that we haven't tapped yet, someone who has dealt with similar problems in different contexts, someone who understands approaches that we haven't considered. Dr. Kim nodded slowly, though Morrison could see she remained skeptical about the likelihood that expanding their search would produce results that their senior team and expensive contractors had missed. All right, James. I'll coordinate the logistics for a comprehensive technical review meeting, But I want to manage expectations. The chances that someone without enterprise infrastructure experience will have insights that could solve our current crisis are pretty slim. Morrison smiled grimly as he thought about the military principle that had guided his decision. Sarah, in my experience, the solutions that save you from impossible situations are usually the ones that seem pretty slim until they work. What neither Morrison nor Dr. Kim knew was that their expanded search for solutions was about to intersect with Elena Vasquez's carefully hidden expertise in ways that would transform their crisis from an unsolvable technical disaster into an opportunity for the kind of innovative problem-solving that would ultimately strengthen Pinnacle Dynamics beyond anything they had achieved before the failure occurred. Elena was currently 30 floors below, methodically cleaning conference rooms that contained the evidence of 3 days of failed recovery attempts, carrying in her mind the technical solutions that could resolve their crisis in hours rather than weeks, waiting for an opportunity that neither she nor the executives above her could have anticipated. The stage was set for the collision between Morrison's willingness to consider unconventional sources of expertise and Elena's desperate need to find a way to contribute the solutions she possessed without exposing herself to the psychological pressures that had driven her away from her previous career. The all-hands technical meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m. Saturday morning in the main auditorium, and by 7:45, Elena Vasquez found herself standing outside the building in the gray Seattle dawn, her hands trembling as she stared at the employee entrance she had walked through hundreds of times before. But this morning was different. This morning, she wasn't arriving for her night cleaning shift. She was arriving as someone who had been specifically invited to contribute her technical expertise to the most critical crisis in Pinnacle Dynamics history. The invitation had come through a company-wide email sent to all employees with any systems background, regardless of their current role. Elena had stared at her phone screen for 20 minutes when the message appeared, reading and rereading the words that seemed to offer exactly the opportunity she had been unconsciously hoping for, while simultaneously triggering every anxiety response she had spent years learning to manage. All employees with technical systems experience are invited to participate in an emergency solution-finding session, the email had read. We are facing unprecedented technical challenges that require innovative approaches and diverse perspectives. Your background and insights may be exactly what we need to resolve this crisis. Elena had spent the entire night pacing her studio apartment, alternately convinced that she should attend the meeting, and equally convinced that doing so would be a catastrophic mistake. The rational part of her mind recognized that this was precisely the opportunity she would need to share her insights without having to overcome the social barriers that normally separated cleaning staff from technical decision-makers. But the anxious part of her mind, the part that had learned to associate visibility with danger and professional exposure with psychological trauma, screamed warnings about the risks of stepping forward. The compromise Elena had reached with herself was to attend the meeting as a participant rather than a presenter. She could listen to the technical challenges being discussed, evaluate whether her insights were genuinely relevant, and then decide whether to contribute based on the specific context and social dynamics she observed. She didn't have to commit to revealing her full background or expertise. She could simply offer technical suggestions as someone with systems experience, which was technically accurate, even if it was dramatically understated. But standing outside the building in her civilian clothes, dark jeans, a plain navy sweater, and sneakers that were clean but clearly not expensive, Elena felt exposed in ways that her cleaning uniform had never made her feel. The uniform had been a kind of camouflage that made her invisible and explained her presence anywhere in the building. Without it, she was just another employee, expected to contribute and perform and justify her participation in ways that made her chest tight with familiar anxiety. Elena forced herself to walk through the entrance, nodding to Tommy Rodriguez at the security desk, who looked surprised to see her during daytime hours. "Morning, Elena," he said with a curious smile. "Didn't expect to see you for the big meeting. You got systems experience too?" "A little," Elena replied quietly, which was perhaps the most significant understatement she had ever made. She signed in on the visitor log and headed toward the elevator, her heart rate increasing with each floor as she rose toward the auditorium, where she would soon be surrounded by the kind of technical professionals she had once been. In an environment that demanded exactly the kind of performance and visibility that had become so overwhelming for her. The auditorium was already half full when Elena entered, and she was surprised by the diversity of people who had responded. To Dr. Morrison's invitation, she recognized some faces from her cleaning rounds: software developers she had seen working late, network administrators who maintained the infrastructure she cleaned around, help desk technicians who provided user support. But there were also people she had never seen before, contractors and consultants and employees from departments she rarely encountered during her night shift. Elena chose a seat in the back corner, positioning herself where she could observe the proceedings without being easily noticed by the speakers or other participants. She pulled out a small notebook, not the hidden notebook where she had documented her technical solutions, but a clean one that would allow her to take notes without revealing the extent of her preparation for this moment. Dr. Morrison entered the auditorium at exactly 8 a.m., followed by his senior leadership team and several contractors Elena didn't recognize. Even from her position in the back, Elena could see the exhaustion and stress that 3 days of crisis management had etched into their faces. These were accomplished professionals who had built their careers on solving complex technical problems, and their body language conveyed the frustration of experts who had reached the limits of their conventional expertise. "Thank you all for coming," Dr. Morrison began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. "I know that some of you are wondering why you're here, why we're holding an all-hands technical meeting instead of limiting our crisis response to senior infrastructure specialists. The answer is simple. We're facing a technical challenge that has defeated our best conventional approaches, and we need to consider solutions that might come from unconventional sources." Elena felt her pulse quicken as Morrison continued. "Over the next hour, my team is going to present the technical details of our current crisis and the recovery methods we've attempted. Then we're going to open the floor for input from anyone who thinks they might have relevant insights, regardless of their current role or official qualifications." Dr. Sarah Kim took the stage next, and for the following 30 minutes she provided a comprehensive technical briefing that confirmed everything Elena had observed during her cleaning rounds and more. The cascade failure that had started with hardware problems in a single server rack had been amplified by redundancy systems that were designed to prevent exactly this kind of comprehensive infrastructure collapse. Firmware bugs had corrupted storage allocation tables across multiple arrays, making it impossible to locate and access client data using conventional database recovery methods. Elena listened with growing excitement as Dr. Kim described failed recovery attempts that had been based on standard enterprise restoration procedures, approaches that assumed the availability of clean backup systems and the integrity of underlying storage architectures. Every method they had tried was designed for scenarios where systems could be restored to known good states, rather than scenarios where the fundamental infrastructure had been compromised in ways that made traditional restoration impossible. As the technical presentation continued, Elena began sketching notes that documented the specific parameters of Pinnacle Dynamics crisis and how they mapped to the distributed recovery techniques she had developed during her military service. The cascade failure pattern was almost identical to the electronic warfare scenarios she had encountered in Afghanistan, where hostile actors had specifically targeted redundancy systems to maximize the damage from initial infrastructure attacks. The solution Elena had developed for military communication systems was designed for exactly this kind of scenario. Situations where backup systems had been compromised, where storage allocation tables had been corrupted, and where conventional restoration methods would take too long to maintain operational capability. Her approach focused on creating functional systems from partially damaged infrastructure, using advanced algorithmic techniques to identify and isolate clean data segments that could be rapidly integrated into temporary operational frameworks. When Dr. Kim finished her presentation and Dr. Morrison opened the floor for questions and suggestions, Elena felt her throat tighten with the familiar anxiety that accompanied moments when she had to choose between safety and service. Around her, other attendees were beginning to ask questions and offer suggestions, most of which Elena could immediately recognize as variations on the conventional approaches that had already been attempted and failed. Elena listened as a senior. Software developer suggested alternative backup restoration strategies that would still require weeks of manual data reconstruction. She heard a network administrator propose hardware replacement approaches that would solve the initial failure, but wouldn't address the corrupted storage allocation tables that were preventing data access. She watched as several contractors offered consulting services that would expand the technical team, but wouldn't fundamentally change the methodology being used to address the crisis. After 45 minutes of questions and suggestions that largely echoed the conventional approaches that had already proven inadequate, Elena realized that no one in the auditorium was going to propose the kind of distributed recovery techniques that could actually resolve Pinnacle Dynamics crisis quickly enough to save the company. The expertise needed to implement her solution wasn't present among the attendees, and the approaches being discussed would still require weeks or months to restore full operational capability. Elena looked down at her notebook, where she had sketched out the basic framework for a distributed recovery approach that could restore critical client operations within hours rather than days. She thought about the technical documentation hidden in her apartment, the detailed specifications she had developed for implementing military-grade recovery techniques in enterprise environments. She thought about Dr. Patricia Williams at Seattle Children's Hospital, whose voice had carried desperate urgency when Elena had overheard parts of her phone conversation with Dr. Morrison. But Elena also thought about the panic attacks that had driven her away from Google, about the hypervigilance that made it difficult to function in collaborative technical environments, about the carefully constructed invisibility that had allowed her to survive and rebuild after her previous career had collapsed. Standing up in this auditorium and revealing her expertise would mean abandoning all of that safety, exposing herself to exactly the kind of performance pressure and professional scrutiny that had become so overwhelming. The internal battle Elena fought in that moment was between two fundamental aspects of her identity: the engineer who possessed solutions to critical problems, and the trauma survivor who had learned that visibility meant vulnerability. For 3 years, she had chosen safety over service, invisibility over impact, survival over significance. But sitting in that auditorium, surrounded by brilliant people who were genuinely trying to solve problems that affected thousands of lives, Elena began to understand that her choice was not just about her own comfort and security. Elena thought about her daughter, who lived with her ex-husband in Portland, and who still believed that her mother was going to be a computer engineer again someday. She thought about the army values that had shaped her character during her years of military service: duty, honor, service before self. She thought about the Google colleagues who had mentored her and supported her career development, who had believed in her potential even when she couldn't believe in it herself. As the meeting began to wind down and Dr. Morrison prepared to thank everyone for their participation, Elena felt something shift inside her chest. It was the same feeling she had experienced in Afghanistan when she had made the decision to volunteer for hazardous duty assignments that would put her communications expertise to use in the most dangerous and critical situations. It was the recognition that sometimes the right choice was also the difficult choice, and that her gifts were not meant to be hidden away for her own protection, but shared in service of problems that were bigger than her own comfort. Elena raised her hand. The gesture was small and quiet, nothing like the confident presentations she had given during her Google years or the authoritative briefings she had delivered to military commanders in combat zones. But in the context of her carefully constructed invisibility, raising her hand in that auditorium was an act of extraordinary courage that marked the beginning of the most important transformation of her life. Dr. Morrison noticed her raised hand and nodded in her direction. "Yes, you have a question or suggestion?" Elena stood up slowly, her legs unsteady, but her voice clearer than she had expected when she began to speak. "Dr. Morrison, I think I might have some insights that could help with your recovery challenge, but they're based on approaches that are quite different from the enterprise methods that have been discussed today." The auditorium fell quiet as everyone turned to look at the woman in the back corner who had just suggested that she might have solutions that the senior technical team had overlooked. Elena could feel dozens of eyes on her, and her body began flooding with the hypervigilant alertness that had kept her alive in combat zones, but had made civilian professional environments so difficult to navigate. But for the first time in 3 years, Elena didn't retreat from the attention. Instead, she took a deep breath and prepared to reveal that the night-cleaning woman they had barely noticed possessed exactly the expertise that might save their company from catastrophic failure. Elena's voice was steadier than her hands as she began to speak, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't accessed since her military service. The approaches being discussed today are all based on restoring your systems to their previous operational state, using clean backup data and rebuilt storage allocation tables. But what if we approached this differently? What if instead of trying to restore everything to exactly how it was before, we created new operational frameworks that could function effectively with the infrastructure you have right now? A murmur rippled through the auditorium as Elena's words registered with the technical professionals who had spent days focusing on conventional restoration methods. Dr. Morrison leaned forward in his chair, his expression shifting from polite attention to genuine curiosity. "Can you be more specific about what you mean by new operational frameworks?" Elena felt her heart racing, but she forced herself to continue. "During my previous experience with large-scale infrastructure failures, I worked on distributed recovery, techniques that were designed for scenarios where backup systems had been compromised, and conventional restoration methods would take too long to maintain critical operations." She paused, realizing that she was about to reveal more about her background than she had shared with anyone at Pinnacle Dynamics during her 3 years of employment. These techniques focus on identifying and isolating functional data segments from corrupted storage systems, then using advanced algorithmic approaches to verify data integrity and create temporary distributed storage configurations that can maintain essential operations while permanent repairs are completed in the background. Dr. Kim stood up from her seat in the front row, her expression skeptical but interested. "That's an interesting theoretical approach, but implementing something like that would require extremely sophisticated understanding of low-level storage systems and the ability to work directly with corrupted data structures. It's not the kind of thing that can be accomplished without very specialized expertise. Elena took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would forever change her relationship with everyone in the auditorium. I have that expertise. I'm Elena Vasquez, and I was a staff software engineer at Google for 3 years, specializing in distributed systems architecture and large-scale server optimization. Before that, I served 4 years in the Army Signal Corps, where I developed recovery techniques for maintaining communications infrastructure under adverse conditions. The silence that followed Elena's revelation was so complete that she could hear the hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant sound of traffic on the street below. Every person in the auditorium was staring at her with expressions that ranged from confusion to amazement to disbelief. Elena could see the mental calculations happening on dozens of faces as people tried to reconcile the quiet night-cleaning woman they had barely noticed with the highly credentialed engineer who had just described expertise that exceeded anything their senior technical team possessed. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Dr. Morrison was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and growing excitement. Ms. Vasquez, are you saying that you've been working here as cleaning staff while possessing the exact technical background we need to address our current crisis? Elena nodded, her voice becoming stronger as she committed fully to the revelation she had been avoiding for 3 years. I left Google because I was struggling with post-traumatic stress from my military service. The symptoms made it difficult to function in collaborative technical environments, and I couldn't maintain the performance standards that my role required. I took the cleaning position here because it allowed me to work independently and avoid the social pressures that had become overwhelming. She looked around the auditorium at faces that were beginning to show understanding rather than just surprise. But during my night shifts, I've been observing the technical challenges that your teams encounter. I've seen the approaches being used to address various infrastructure problems, and I've been mentally working through solutions based on the techniques I developed during my military service. Elena reached into her notebook and pulled out several pages of technical diagrams she had sketched during Dr. Kim's presentation. The cascade failure you're experiencing follows a pattern that's almost identical to the electronic warfare scenarios I encountered in Afghanistan. The solution isn't to restore your corrupted storage systems to their previous state. It's to create new operational frameworks that can provide essential functionality while working around the compromised components. Dr. Kim walked up the auditorium aisle toward Elena, her skepticism now mixed with genuine professional interest. Can you show me specifically what you're proposing? Elena moved to the front of the auditorium, her anxiety about being the center of attention overwhelmed by the familiar satisfaction of working through complex technical problems. She took a marker and began drawing on the whiteboard, her movements becoming more confident as she shifted into the analytical mode that had once made her one of Google's most valued infrastructure engineers. The key insight is that your storage allocation tables aren't completely corrupted. They're fragmented and inconsistent, but they still contain recoverable information about data location and structure, Elena explained as she sketched out system architecture diagrams with the fluid precision of someone who had spent years visualizing complex technical relationships. Instead of trying to rebuild these tables from scratch, we can use pattern recognition algorithms to identify data segments that are internally consistent and verifiably intact. She drew interconnected boxes representing distributed storage nodes, with arrows showing data flow patterns that bypassed corrupted system components. Once we've identified clean data segments, we can create temporary distributed storage configurations that aggregate these segments into functional databases. The approach doesn't restore your original storage architecture, but it provides immediate access to client data while permanent reconstruction continues in the background. Elena turned to face the auditorium, and for the first time since her Google years, she felt the exhilaration of presenting technical solutions to an audience that could understand and implement her ideas. The distributed recovery techniques I'm describing can typically restore critical functionality within 6 to 12 hours, depending on the extent of data fragmentation and the processing power available for pattern recognition analysis. Software developer in the middle of the auditorium raised his hand. Ms. Vasquez, the algorithmic complexity of what you're describing sounds extraordinary. Pattern recognition across terabytes of fragmented storage data would require computational resources and programming expertise that most companies don't have access to. Elena smiled for the first time since entering the auditorium. You're absolutely right about the complexity, but the computational requirements are more manageable than they initially appear. The pattern recognition algorithms can be parallelized across multiple processing nodes, and the verification procedures can be optimized to focus on the most critical data segments first. I've implemented similar systems using standard enterprise hardware configurations. Dr. Morrison stood up and walked toward the whiteboard where Elena had sketched out her distributed recovery framework. Ms. Vasquez, I need to ask you directly. Do you believe that your approach could restore access to our client data within the timeline we need to prevent catastrophic business failure? Elena looked at the technical diagrams she had drawn, mentally reviewing the implementation steps that would be required and the potential complications that could arise during execution. Dr. Morrison, based on what I've observed about your infrastructure and the specific nature of your cascade failure, I believe we could restore critical client operations within 12 hours and achieve substantial data recovery within 72 hours. But implementing this approach would require your technical team to trust techniques that are quite different from conventional enterprise recovery methods. Dr. Kim stepped forward, her expression now showing the kind of professional respect that Elena hadn't experienced since her Google years. Ms. Vasquez, what would you need from us to implement your distributed recovery approach? Elena felt a surge of the same confidence that had once made her presentations at technical conferences so compelling. I would need access to your storage monitoring systems so I can analyze the specific patterns of data fragmentation. I would need a development environment where I can adapt my recovery algorithms to work with your particular infrastructure configuration, and I would need a small team of systems engineers who can help with implementation while I focus on the algorithmic components. She paused, looking around the auditorium at faces that were now showing genuine excitement about possibilities that hadn't existed an hour earlier. Most importantly, I would need everyone to understand that this approach involves calculated risks. We'll be working with compromised data structures using techniques that aren't covered in standard enterprise recovery manuals. There's a possibility that some data segments that appear recoverable might turn out to be more corrupted than our initial analysis suggests. Dr. Morrison nodded firmly. Ms. Vasquez, given our current situation, calculated risks based on innovative techniques are preferable to guaranteed failure using conventional methods. What do you need to get started? Elena looked at the whiteboard covered with her technical diagrams, then back at the auditorium filled with colleagues who were seeing her expertise for the first time. The transformation from invisible cleaning woman to recognized technical expert was happening so rapidly that she felt slightly dizzy, but it was also accompanied by a sense of rightness that she hadn't experienced since her military service. I Need to examine your current storage monitoring data and run some preliminary pattern recognition analyses to confirm that my approach is viable for your specific infrastructure, Elena replied. If the initial analysis looks promising, I can begin implementing the distributed recovery framework immediately. As Elena spoke, she could see the energy in the auditorium shifting from the dejected exhaustion that had characterized the past 3 days to something approaching optimism. The technical professionals around her were beginning to ask detailed questions about implementation procedures, resource requirements, and timeline projections. Dr. Kim was already coordinating with her team to provide Elena with access to the systems and data she would need to begin her analysis. But Elena was also aware of a different kind of transformation happening within herself. For 3 years, she had constructed her identity around invisibility and self-protection, around avoiding the performance pressures and social complexity that had become so overwhelming during her previous career. Now, in the span of less than an hour, she had revealed her expertise to dozens of colleagues and committed to leading the most critical technical project in Pinnacle Dynamics history. The anxiety that had once paralyzed her in collaborative technical environments was still present, but it was now mixed with excitement and purpose that made it manageable rather than overwhelming. Elena realized that her military experience had taught her to function effectively under extreme pressure, and her Google experience had given her the technical confidence to tackle problems that seemed impossible to others. The combination of those experiences, refined by 3 years of careful observation and independent problem-solving, had created capabilities that were uniquely suited to Pinnacle Dynamics' current crisis. As the meeting began to break up and Elena found herself surrounded by technical team members eager to support her recovery efforts, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The trauma that had driven her away from her previous career had also given her perspectives on resilience and adaptation that were proving invaluable in the current crisis. The invisibility that had protected her during her recovery period had also allowed her to observe problems and develop solutions without the constraints of conventional thinking. Elena Vasquez, the shy cleaning woman who had spent 3 years hiding her expertise behind a janitorial uniform, was about to become Elena Vasquez, the innovative engineer whose unconventional approaches would either save Pinnacle Dynamics from catastrophic failure or demonstrate that her confidence in her abilities had been misplaced. But as she looked around at the faces of colleagues who were now seeing her as the potential solution to their most critical challenge, Elena felt more certain than she had in years that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The initial euphoria that had followed Elena's revelation lasted exactly 4 hours and 37 minutes. By 2 p.m. on Saturday afternoon, as Elena sat in conference room A, surrounded by system monitoring displays that painted an even grimmer picture than she had anticipated, she began to understand that her confidence in the distributed recovery approach might have been premature. The cascade failure at Pinnacle Dynamics was more extensive and more complex than anything she had encountered during her military service, or even imagined during her 3 years of observing the company's infrastructure from a distance. Dr. Kim stood behind Elena's workstation, watching as diagnostic algorithms revealed layer after layer of storage corruption that extended far beyond what the initial failure analysis had suggested. "Elena," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who was beginning to suspect that their last hope might be evaporating in real time. "These pattern recognition results are showing fragmentation levels that are significantly higher than what we discussed in the auditorium this morning." Elena stared at the data streaming across her monitor, her stomach sinking as she realized that the elegant distributed recovery solution she had presented with such confidence was encountering complications that threatened to make it as ineffective as the conventional approaches that had already failed. The storage allocation tables weren't just corrupted or fragmented, they had been systematically destroyed by firmware bugs that had operated like a virus, spreading damage through interconnected systems in ways that made data recovery exponentially more difficult. "The corruption isn't random," Elena said, her voice tight with growing concern. "It's following patterns that suggest the firmware bug was designed to maximize damage to redundancy systems. This isn't just a cascade failure. It's starting to look like the storage architecture was systematically compromised by malicious code that specifically targeted the backup and recovery mechanisms we would normally rely on." David Park, who had been monitoring Elena's analysis from a workstation across the room, looked up with an expression of alarm. "Elena, are you saying that we might be dealing with a deliberate attack rather than a hardware failure?" Elena pulled up additional diagnostic displays that showed the progression of corruption through Pinnacle Dynamics storage systems over the past 72 hours. The patterns were unmistakable to someone with her background in military communications security. The damage had spread through the infrastructure in ways that targeted the most critical recovery mechanisms first, then systematically eliminated backup options that would normally allow for rapid restoration. I can't definitively confirm whether this was a deliberate attack or an extremely unfortunate combination of hardware failure and firmware vulnerabilities, Elena replied, her mind racing through the implications of what she was discovering. But the end result is the same. Your storage infrastructure has been compromised in ways that make conventional recovery approaches ineffective. And even my distributed recovery techniques are encountering complications that I didn't anticipate. Dr. Morrison, who had been monitoring Elena's progress from his office, arrived in the conference room just as she was explaining the extent of the challenges they were facing. His expression shifted from hopeful anticipation to barely controlled desperation as he absorbed the technical details Elena was presenting. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "Ms. Vasquez," he said, settling into a chair at the conference table, "please tell me directly, can your distributed recovery approach still work, given what you've discovered about the extent of the corruption?" Eleanor turned away from her, monitor to face Dr. Morrison, and for the first time since revealing her expertise, she felt the familiar weight of performance pressure that had made her previous career so overwhelming. The entire future of Pinnacle Dynamics was depending on her ability to solve a technical problem that was proving to be more complex than anyone had imagined, and the stakes of potential failure were becoming clearer with each passing hour. "Dr. Morrison," Elena began, her voice careful and measured, "the distributed recovery techniques I described this morning are still theoretically viable, but implementing them will be significantly more complex and time-consuming than I originally projected. The pattern recognition algorithms I've developed can identify clean data segments even in highly fragmented storage systems. But the level of systematic corruption we're dealing with means that each recovered segment will require extensive verification procedures to ensure data integrity." She pulled up a timeline projection that showed recovery estimates extending far beyond the 12-hour window she had confidently proposed during the morning meeting. "Instead of restoring critical operations within 12 hours, we're now looking at a minimum of 48 to 72 hours just to establish basic functionality for the most essential client services. Complete data recovery could take 2 to 3 weeks, even with the distributed approach." Dr. Kim sat down heavily in a chair next to Dr. Morrison, her exhaustion now mixed with something approaching despair. "Elena, That timeline is still better than the manual reconstruction approach we were considering, but it might not be fast enough to prevent the business catastrophe we're trying to avoid. We've already lost several major clients, and 48 hours of continued outage will likely result in additional contract cancellations that could be impossible to reverse. Elena felt her chest tightening with the familiar anxiety that had once made collaborative technical work so difficult. She was surrounded by brilliant professionals who were looking to her for solutions to a crisis that exceeded even her considerable expertise, and the weight of their expectations was becoming overwhelming in ways that reminded her why she had fled from her previous career. But this time, instead of allowing the anxiety to paralyze her decision-making, Elena found herself drawing on lessons from her military experience about functioning effectively under extreme pressure when conventional options had been exhausted. During her deployments in Afghanistan, she had faced numerous situations where critical communications infrastructure had been damaged beyond the scope of standard repair procedures, forcing her to develop innovative solutions that combined existing techniques in unconventional ways. "There might be another approach," Elena said slowly, her mind working through possibilities that combined her distributed recovery techniques with more aggressive data reconstruction methods. Instead of trying to recover all client data simultaneously, we could focus on restoring the most critical systems, first using a hybrid approach that combines distributed recovery with selective manual reconstruction. She stood up and walked to the whiteboard, beginning to sketch out a triage-based recovery strategy that would prioritize client systems based on operational criticality and data integrity assessments. We identify the clients whose data shows the highest probability of successful recovery, implement distributed recovery techniques for those systems first, and restore their operations while continuing more complex reconstruction efforts for the remaining clients. Elena drew interconnecting flowcharts that showed how prioritized recovery could provide immediate relief for the most critical client systems, while buying time for comprehensive restoration of the remaining infrastructure. This approach wouldn't solve everything immediately, but it could restore functionality for maybe 60 to 70% of your clients within 24 hours, which might be enough to prevent complete business collapse while we work on the remaining systems. Dr. Morrison studied the whiteboard diagrams, his expression showing the kind of strategic thinking that had built Pinnacle Dynamics into a major enterprise. "Ms. Vasquez, that approach makes sense from a business continuity perspective, but how do we decide which clients get priority treatment? How do we explain to the remaining clients that their data recovery will be delayed?" Elena felt a familiar surge of the analytical thinking that had once made her presentations at Google so compelling. "We prioritize based on a combination of factors: operational criticality, data integrity probability, and business relationship value. Hospitals and financial institutions get first priority because their operations directly affect public safety. Clients whose data shows higher integrity probability get faster recovery because the resource investment is more likely to succeed." She turned back to face the room, her confidence growing as she worked through the implementation details of the hybrid recovery strategy. "The remaining clients get honest communication about the timeline and the technical challenges we're facing, along with temporary solutions that might not restore full functionality, but could provide essential access to their most critical data." David Park looked up from his workstation where he had been analyzing Elena's latest diagnostic results. "Elena, the hybrid approach you're describing sounds promising, but it would require us to make recovery decisions based on incomplete information about data integrity. What if we prioritize the wrong systems and end up spending resources on recovery attempts that ultimately fail?" Elena nodded, acknowledging the risk that Park had identified. David, you're absolutely right that we'll be making decisions based on incomplete information. But the alternative is continuing to pursue comprehensive recovery approaches that are taking too long to prevent business failure. Sometimes in crisis situations, you have to make calculated decisions based on the best information available, rather than waiting for perfect information that might never come. She walked back to her workstation and pulled up probability analyses that showed the likelihood of successful recovery for different client systems based on the pattern recognition algorithm she had been running. Based on my analysis, we have high confidence recovery probabilities for about 40% of your client systems, moderate confidence for another 30%, and low confidence for the remaining 30%. The hybrid approach would focus our immediate efforts on the high and moderate confidence systems while developing alternative strategies for the low confidence cases. Dr. Kim studied the probability analyses Elena had generated, her expression showing professional respect for the sophisticated technical approach Elena was proposing. Elena, your hybrid recovery strategy addresses the business reality we're facing better than any approach we've considered. But implementing it successfully will require coordination between multiple technical teams and careful management of client communications. Are you prepared to lead that kind of complex project management effort? Elena felt her throat tighten as she realized that accepting Dr. Kim's challenge would mean taking on exactly the kind of high-visibility leadership role that had become so overwhelming during her Google years. Leading the hybrid recovery effort would require not just technical expertise, but also project coordination, team management, and client communication responsibilities that would put her at center of the kind of collaborative pressure that had triggered her most severe anxiety responses. But Elena also realized that declining the leadership role would likely mean watching her hybrid recovery strategy fail due to inadequate coordination and implementation, which would result in the same business catastrophe that conventional approaches had been unable to prevent. The technical solution she had developed was sophisticated enough to work, but only if it was implemented with the kind of systematic precision and strategic thinking that her military and Google experience had taught her to provide. Dr. Kim, Elena said, her voice steady despite the anxiety she was feeling, I'm prepared to lead the hybrid recovery implementation, but I'll need support from your team for the project coordination and client communication components. My expertise is strongest in the technical aspects of the recovery process, and I'll be most effective if I can focus on those areas while working with specialists who can handle the business relationship management. Dr. Morrison stood up and extended his hand to Elena, his expression showing the kind of respect typically reserved for senior executive colleagues. Ms. Vasquez, you have whatever support you need to implement your hybrid recovery strategy. Sarah will coordinate the project management aspects, David will handle technical team coordination, and I'll personally manage client communications. Your job is to focus on the technical leadership that only you can provide. As Elena shook Dr. Morrison's hand, she realized that she had just committed to leading the most critical project in Pinnacle Dynamics history, using techniques that had never been tested at this scale, under pressure that would determine the future of hundreds of employees and thousands of client operations. The shy cleaning woman, who had spent 3 years hiding her expertise, was about to become the technical leader responsible for either saving the company or presiding over its catastrophic failure. But instead of the paralyzing anxiety she had expected, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced since her military service. The calm focus that came from accepting a mission that was both critically important and uniquely suited to her particular combination of skills and experience. She was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, even if the stakes were higher than anything she had ever faced before. The transformation began at 4:17 a.m. on Sunday morning, 18 hours into Elena's hybrid recovery. Implementation, when the first client system came back online with a soft chime that echoed through the emergency operations center like a bell announcing salvation. Elena looked up from her workstation where she had been monitoring pattern recognition algorithms for the past 6 hours straight. Her eyes red with exhaustion, but bright with the kind of focused intensity that had once made her legendary among her Google colleagues. Pacific Northwest Credit Union is fully operational, she announced to the room, her voice carrying across the conference space that had been transformed into a 24-hour technical command center. Customer account access restored. Transaction processing online and all critical banking services functioning normally. The response from the dozen technical team members scattered throughout the room was immediate and electric. David Park looked up from his diagnostic station with the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him in 4 days. Dr. Kim, who had been coordinating with client communication teams, paused in her phone conversation to give Elena a thumbs up that conveyed both congratulations and profound relief. Even the contractors, who had been brought in from IBM and Oracle, initially skeptical of Elena's unconventional techniques, began clustering around her workstation to understand how she had achieved in 18 hours what conventional methods had failed to accomplish in 72, but Elena barely had time to acknowledge the celebration before her algorithms flagged the next priority target. Seattle Children's Hospital data integrity analysis is complete, she called out, her fingers flying across multiple keyboards as she coordinated the distributed recovery processes running across dozens of processing nodes. Pattern recognition shows 93% confidence for critical patient data systems. Beginning recovery sequence now. Dr. Morrison, who had been managing crisis communications from his office, arrived in the operations center just as Elena initiated the hospital recovery procedures. He had been awake for over 80 hours, surviving on coffee, and the desperate hope that Elena's hybrid approach might prevent the complete collapse of everything he had spent 15 years building. Now, watching her work with the calm precision of someone who had found her perfect professional environment, he began to understand that they might not just survive this crisis. They might emerge from it stronger than they had been before. Elena, Dr. Morrison said, settling into a chair beside her primary workstation, can you walk me through what's happening with the hospital recovery? Dr. Williams has been calling every 2 hours asking for updates. Elena's hands never stopped, moving across her keyboards as she explained the complex technical processes that were restoring critical healthcare data in real time. The pattern recognition algorithms identified that the hospital's patient management database was fragmented across 17 different storage nodes, but the fragments maintained internal consistency that allowed for distributed reconstruction. Instead of trying to rebuild the original database architecture, I'm creating a new distributed framework that aggregates the clean fragments into a functional system. She gestured toward one of her monitoring displays, which showed data flowing between interconnected nodes in patterns that resembled a complex digital ecosystem. The new framework doesn't replicate their original system exactly, but it provides all the functionality they need for patient care: medication tracking, surgical scheduling, laboratory results, and treatment protocols. The recovery process preserves data relationships and maintains audit trails, so they'll have complete operational capability even though the underlying architecture is different. As Elena spoke, her monitoring systems chimed with another successful recovery completion. Northwest Financial's real-time transaction processing system had been restored, followed minutes later by the supply chain coordination platform for Pacific Manufacturing. Each successful recovery built momentum for the next, as Elena's algorithms became more sophisticated at identifying recoverable data patterns, and her team became more efficient at implementing the distributed recovery procedures. But the transformation wasn't just technical. Elena herself was changing in ways that surprised everyone who had known her during her 3 years as invisible cleaning staff. The anxiety that had once made collaborative work overwhelming was still present, but it was now channeled into the kind of hyper-vigilant attention to detail that made her recovery procedures remarkably precise. The trauma responses that had driven her away from her Google career were being redirected into systematic problem-solving approaches that anticipated and prevented the kinds of failures that had defeated conventional recovery methods. Elena, Dr. Kim said, approaching her workstation with a tablet displaying client status reports, I've been watching your recovery success rates, and they're exceeding even your most optimistic projections. 87% of the high-priority clients are now fully operational, and we're ahead of schedule on the moderate priority systems. How is this possible? Elena looked up from her screens for the first time in hours, her expression showing the kind of professional satisfaction she hadn't experienced since her military service. Sarah, the distributed recovery techniques are working better than expected because the corruption patterns turned out to be more systematic than random. Once I understood how the damage had spread through the storage architecture, I could predict where clean data segments would be located and optimize the recovery algorithms accordingly. She pulled up a visualization that showed Pinnacle Dynamics storage infrastructure as a 3-dimensional network of interconnected nodes, with recovered systems glowing green and ongoing recovery processes pulsing with blue light. But the real breakthrough was recognizing that we didn't need to restore the original system architectures. By creating new distributed frameworks that could aggregate clean data from multiple sources, we bypassed the corrupted allocation tables entirely and built functional systems that were actually more resilient than what existed before the failure. David Park, who had been coordinating with the technical implementation teams, joined the conversation with an expression of professional admiration that Elena had never seen directed toward her during her cleaning years. Elena, what you've accomplished in the past 18 hours represents a fundamental advancement in enterprise disaster recovery methodology. The techniques you've developed could revolutionize how companies approach large-scale infrastructure failures. Elena felt a warmth spreading through her chest that she hadn't experienced since her Google patents had been approved. The recognition of her technical achievements was gratifying, but more importantly, she was beginning to understand that her 3 years of careful observation and independent problem-solving had actually enhanced her capabilities rather than diminishing them. The invisibility that had protected her during her recovery period had also given her unique perspectives on how complex systems actually functioned in practice. Insights that were proving invaluable in developing innovative solutions. As the recovery operations continued throughout Sunday morning, Elena found herself naturally assuming the kind of technical leadership role that had once seemed impossible. She coordinated between multiple teams, made strategic decisions about resource allocation, and provided the kind of authoritative guidance that kept complex recovery procedures running smoothly, even when unexpected complications arose. But perhaps, most remarkably, Elena discovered that the collaborative pressure that had once triggered her most severe anxiety responses was now manageable because she was working in service of something larger than her own career advancement. The recovery effort wasn't about proving her worth or meeting performance expectations. It was about restoring critical systems that people depended on for their safety, their livelihoods, and their ability to serve others in turn. Dr. Morrison, who had been observing Elena's leadership throughout the recovery process, approached her workstation as the morning shift change was beginning. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying a weight of respect and gratitude that surprised her. "I need to tell you something that I probably should have said hours ago. What you've accomplished during this crisis is extraordinary, not just technically, but as an example of leadership under extreme pressure." Elena looked up from her monitors, her exhaustion now mixed with something approaching exhilaration. "Dr. Morrison, I'm just using the skills I developed during my military and Google experience to solve problems that happen to match those capabilities. I'm not doing anything more than what the situation requires." Dr. Morrison smiled, with the kind of recognition that comes from years of identifying exceptional talent in unexpected places. "Elena, what you're describing as just using your skills represents the kind of innovative thinking and calm decision-making under pressure that most people never develop, regardless of their educational background or professional experience. The fact that you've been able to lead this recovery effort while managing your own personal challenges makes your achievements even more remarkable." He gestured toward the monitoring displays that showed system after system coming back online, as Elena's distributed recovery processes continued to execute with mechanical precision. "But beyond the technical achievements, what I've observed over the past day is someone who has discovered that her greatest strengths emerge when she's working in service of something larger than herself. That's not a technical skill, that's leadership character that can't be taught." As Elena absorbed Dr. Morrison's words, she began to understand that the transformation she was experiencing wasn't just about overcoming the trauma that had driven her away from her previous career. It was about discovering that her unique combination of technical expertise, military discipline, and hard-won understanding of resilience under pressure had created capabilities that were perfectly suited for exactly this kind of crisis leadership. The shy cleaning woman who had spent 3 years hiding her potential was evolving into someone who could not only solve impossible technical problems, but could do so while inspiring confidence in the teams around her and maintaining the kind of strategic perspective that kept complex operations focused on their ultimate objectives. By noon on Sunday, Elena's hybrid recovery approach had restored operational capability for over 90% of Pinnacle Dynamics clients, with the remaining systems showing strong probability for complete recovery within the next 24 hours. The company that had been facing catastrophic failure just 2 days earlier was now positioned to emerge from the crisis with enhanced technical capabilities and a deeper understanding of how to manage large-scale infrastructure challenges. But, perhaps more importantly, Elena Vasquez had discovered that the path forward from trauma wasn't about returning to who she had been before, but about integrating her experiences into a new identity that was stronger, more resilient, and more capable than anything she had imagined possible during her years of careful hiding. The transformation was far from complete, but Elena could see a future where her technical expertise, leadership capabilities, and hard-won wisdom about resilience could be used in service of challenges that were both professionally fulfilling and personally meaningful. She was becoming not just the engineer she had once been, but the leader she had always been capable of becoming. 6 months later, Elena Vasquez stood at the podium of the Seattle Convention Center, looking out at an audience of over 800 technology professionals who had come to hear her keynote presentation at the Pacific Northwest Enterprise Recovery Summit. The woman who had once cleaned these very conference halls during night shifts was now being introduced as the architect of revolutionary distributed recovery techniques that are transforming enterprise disaster response across multiple industries. Elena's hands were steady as she adjusted the microphone, a remarkable contrast to the trembling fingers that had once gripped cleaning supplies while she hid her expertise behind a uniform. She wore a navy blue blazer that projected professional authority while remaining true to the understated style that felt authentically hers. Her presentation slides were already loaded, showing technical diagrams that had been refined through months of implementation across dozens of client environments. 6 months ago, Elena began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, I was invisible in the technology industry, not because I lacked expertise or experience, but because trauma had taught me that visibility meant vulnerability, and I had chosen safety over service. Today, I want to share with you what I learned about the hidden potential that exists in every organization and how crisis can become the catalyst for discovering strength we never knew we possessed. The audience was immediately engaged, drawn in by Elena's authentic vulnerability and the promise of insights that went beyond conventional technical presentations. These were seasoned professionals who had attended countless conferences, but Elena's story represented something different, a combination of technical innovation and personal transformation that spoke to deeper questions about resilience, potential, and the courage required to step into visibility when it matters most. Elena clicked to her first slide, showing before and after diagrams of Pinnacle Dynamics infrastructure recovery. The distributed recovery techniques we developed during our crisis have now been successfully implemented at over 40 enterprise clients across North America. But the real innovation wasn't just technical, it was recognizing that solutions often come from unexpected sources, and that the person with the key insight might be the one you've been overlooking. She walked to the side of the stage, making eye contact with audience members as she had learned to do during months of public speaking practice. The anxiety was still there, but it was now channeled into the kind of focused energy that made her presentations compelling rather than overwhelming. Dr. Morrison asked me to join him in founding Pinnacle Recovery Solutions, a consulting firm that specializes in crisis management for enterprise infrastructure failures. But our approach is different from traditional disaster recovery services. We don't just focus on technical solutions. We focus on identifying and leveraging hidden expertise that already exists within organizations facing crisis. Elena's slide changed to show photographs of recovery projects they had completed. A hospital system in Portland, a financial services company in Vancouver, a manufacturing consortium in Denver. Each project had involved not just implementing distributed recovery techniques, but also identifying employees whose backgrounds and expertise had been underutilized by conventional organizational structures. We've discovered that many organizations are sitting on tremendous reservoirs of untapped potential. Military veterans whose tactical problem-solving skills translate perfectly to technical crisis management. Former entrepreneurs whose startup experience gives them innovative approaches to resource-constrained challenges. Career changers whose diverse backgrounds provide unique perspectives on complex systems. The audience was taking notes, but Elena could see that they were also processing the broader implications of what she was describing. The technical recovery methods were impressive, but the organizational philosophy behind them was potentially transformative for how companies approached both crisis management and talent development. Elena clicked to a slide showing Pinnacle Dynamics' current performance metrics. 6 months after our recovery, Pinnacle Dynamics is processing 30% more client data than before the crisis, with infrastructure that's significantly more resilient to cascade failures. But the real transformation has been cultural. The company now actively seeks out employees whose backgrounds don't fit traditional patterns, and has created pathways for expertise to be recognized regardless of someone's current job title. She paused, looking out at faces that showed genuine interest in both the technical and human aspects of her story. I'm still learning to manage the visibility that comes with this kind of work, the trauma that drove me away from my previous Career hasn't disappeared. It's been integrated into skills that make me better at helping others navigate their own transitions from hiding to contributing. Elena's final slide showed a photograph of the current Pinnacle Recovery Solutions team, a diverse group of professionals whose backgrounds included military service, career transitions, and unconventional paths to technical expertise. Elena stood in the center, no longer invisible, but also no longer alone. The cleaning woman who fixed the CEO's server wasn't just a story about hidden technical expertise, Elena concluded. It was a story about how crisis can reveal potential that we didn't know existed, and how stepping forward in service of others can be the path to discovering our own strength. Every organization has people whose capabilities exceed their current roles. Every crisis contains opportunities for transformation that go beyond just solving immediate problems. The applause was sustained and genuine, the kind of response that indicated Elena had connected with her audience on both technical and personal levels. As she answered questions from enterprise executives, technical managers, and HR professionals, Elena realized that her story had become something larger than her individual journey from trauma to recovery. During the networking reception that followed, Elena was approached by dozens of conference attendees who shared their own stories of hidden expertise, career transitions, and the challenge of creating organizational cultures that could recognize and leverage unconventional talent. A military veteran working in IT support described algorithms he had developed for logistics optimization that his company had never seen. A former teacher, now working in customer service, outlined training methodologies that could revolutionize technical onboarding processes. Dr. Morrison, who had been watching Elena's presentation from the back of the auditorium, joined her during a quiet moment between conversations. "Elena," he said, with the kind of professional respect that had replaced his initial amazement at her hidden expertise, "what you've built over the past 6 months extends far beyond the technical solutions we developed during our crisis. You've created a framework for helping organizations discover potential they didn't know they possessed." Elena smiled, feeling the satisfaction of work that aligned with both her technical capabilities and her deeper sense of purpose. "James, I think what we've learned is that innovation often comes from the intersection of different experiences and perspectives. The distributed recovery techniques worked because they combined military tactical thinking with enterprise technical requirements. The organizational changes worked because they recognized that valuable expertise doesn't always come with traditional credentials." As the evening wound down and Elena prepared to return to her hotel, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from invisible cleaning woman to recognized industry leader. The transformation hadn't been about returning to who she had been before her trauma. It had been about becoming someone new, someone who could integrate all of her experiences into capabilities that were uniquely valuable. Elena's story had become a reminder that potential exists everywhere, often hidden behind circumstances that make it difficult to recognize or express. But with the right opportunity, the right support, and the courage to step forward when it matters most, that hidden potential can become the key to transforming not just individual lives, but entire organizations and communities. The shy cleaner, who had once moved invisibly through corporate corridors, had discovered that her greatest strength wasn't just her technical expertise, but her ability to see potential in others and create opportunities for that potential to be expressed. In helping organizations recover from crisis, Elena had found her own path to recovery and transformation. If Elena's story resonates with you, if it makes you think about the hidden expertise that might exist in your own organization or community, Then I invite you to join our growing community of people who believe that innovation comes from unexpected places and that everyone has something valuable to contribute. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us to look beyond conventional expectations, to recognize potential that doesn't always come with traditional credentials, and to have the courage to step forward when our unique capabilities are needed most, because in the end, the most powerful transformations happen when we stop hiding our gifts and start using them in service of something larger than ourselves. The question isn't whether you have something valuable to offer. The question is whether you're ready to let the world see what you're truly capable of achieving.